Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and I'm joined by Doctors Rod Rosenblatt, Scott Keith, and Adam Francisco today. We're going to do an episode on the influence of Lutheran Reform on English Reformation today. And the reason we're doing this is I actually got a listener question in about this on an email. And then shortly after that, there was actually a pretty long debate between some English scholars on Twitter about whether or not there was any influence, and some people said, I don't know if there was. And this was...
Really?
Yeah, this was kind of funny to me. Well-respected professors over in England who just seemed ignorant of the fact if there was or wasn't any.
Well, it was such a flash in the pan, I can imagine.
Yeah, and so I thought it'd be good to do this episode just to address both questions there, and this might also turn partly into a conversation. It was just sort of the broader influence of the Reformation in general. Before we get into that, I do have some things to say. If this is your first episode listening to the Thinking Fellows, welcome. We have many more. We cover topics on history, Christian doctrine, and apologetics. And you can find all of that on your favorite podcasting app through the backlog. There's, I believe, over 200 episodes now in there. So there's quite a bit to go through. And 1517 is launching a brand new website where you'll be able to find the entire catalog of Thinking Fellows episodes, all searchable by name and title and things like that. So I'll put in a link to the website there as well. Another thing I'd like to share is if you live in Europe or maybe the United States, the Thinking Fellows are going to be in Bergen, Norway for the Lutheran Study Days conference. And I'm going to put a link to that conference in the show notes for some upcoming episodes. They've asked us to please share this with listeners, since we do have quite a few listeners in Germany and the like, and the conference is actually pretty accessible if you're in continental Europe. Flights are pretty easy. This is a fantastic conference. We've been going I've gone for 3 years. You went.
I missed last year.
You went for two years, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of great. It's Lutherans from all over talking about history, the comfort of the gospel. I enjoy it. It's really good. If you don't speak Norwegian, don't worry. Anybody who gives a talk in Norwegian or in Danish, or I think those are usually, it's Danish, Norwegian, and English that are usually spoken there. It's all translated live if you don't speak the language of the current lecturer, which is pretty awesome. And the quality of the live translation is phenomenal.
It's amazing.
All three of the hosts besides myself here are going to be having a lecture there this year as well. So we're sort of the Thinking Fellows guests this year, and we'll be doing a live recording during the conference as well. So if you're over there, this is sort of your opportunity to come to to get some 1517 books, to come to a conference that has 1517 coming and joining it this year.
I think you could easily say that if somebody enjoys this show and listens to this show and lives in Europe and can somewhat easily make it to Bergen and make that happen, it'd be more than worth your while.
Yeah,
it's a very good conference.
Yep. So again, I'll put the more serious details in the show notes, but the gist of it is August 29th through September 2nd, I believe, or September 2nd or 1st. I'll put the main details in the show notes with a link to their registration page. And that's the main thing I have to share this episode before we jump in. So I'm just going to kind of leave the question open to the room, maybe do a little bit of introduction. We've done an episode on an English reformer, Thomas Cranmer, before. I think we may have talked a little bit on that episode about the influence of Lutheranism there, but again, this is a topic that I felt like we could revisit. What I know about this is only influence of Melanchthon on things, because he was well-read, I guess, around the entirety of Europe, not only for his theology, but also for pedagogy.
And known by everybody.
Yeah.
And I think I know I like to start things out with Melanchthon, but he's certainly the prominent influence on English reformers.
Yeah, but there is some, at least early on, Luther's known and rejected by the state, essentially by King Henry VIII, pretty aggressively. So
When the reformers gathered to secretly read the works of Luther, because it was forbidden, they met at the White Horse Inn, and afterwards, Lutheranism managed to lose a whole empire. Now you got to be working to do that, but they were dedicated to it, so that you'll find very few parishes left in the English Isles.
That's very much true.
Yeah, I would say today, I mean, this doesn't have as much bearing on something that happened 500 years ago, but when I've visited for class over there or talked to professors who live there, it's rare for them to find somebody who's not only Lutheran, but says they're like a confessing Lutheran, who says that they'd confess the Lutheran confessions. That was the particularly rare part, because they're usually familiar with German scholars who are Lutheran, but aren't Lutheran like American Lutherans tend to say they are. So so even today, it's sort of rare. It's kind of like
go to London and try and find a Lutheran parish on Sunday morning, and you'll be hard pressed. And that's odd when the earliest English reformers presented their case, the spitback was, that's nothing but the Augsburg Confession. It was not intended as a compliment.
Well, that's one of the other things that sparked this episode for me is I was reading some of Cranmer for a different episode that we did for the bonus cast that'll be coming out later this year with Dan Price, and we did 39 articles, and I was like, well, this seems pretty much Lutheran.
Oh, would that all priests in the American Episcopal Church held to the 39 articles.
That's the thing. They just don't have to subscribe to them in a way that especially those of us who come from the LCMS are accustomed to thinking of subscription. You know, they just don't.
I'll give you an
sort of informative.
Anecdotal. This is from way back 20 years ago, but I think it was a true story. It was a guy who was telling me he was at a cocktail party. He's a priest. And another priest's wife came to him and said, Dennis, do you actually hold to the 39 articles? And he said, yeah, I do. She said, that's amazing. You're the first priest I've ever met who does.
Oh, wow. And it's, I would say, at least in our circles, and it's probably because our organization attracts conversation, I'm familiar with sort of people who would call themselves Lutheran Anglicans as well, right? Who... I think I've been to Jacob Smith's church in New York, right? And he would say that about himself.
Yep.
And you go and you hear him preach, and it's long gospel preaching.
I'm guilty for that.
You're guilty for that? Mm-hmm. That's your fault?
Yeah, I worked with several back when Dr. Zoll was the president of Trinity Seminary of the Episcopal Church. And most of those students, many of those students started writing to me. I just did bibliography for them. And some of them said, I think that's what I am. And Jacob was one of those.
And as you were saying, their confession is so loose that you really could be sort of practically Lutheran, or your parish could even be practically Lutheran.
I don't know if I would call it loose because I don't want to offend them, but what I'm saying is that those of us who hail from the LCMS, when we hear the word subscription to a confession, we have a particular thing in mind that's very definite, and we sort of know what it means, and we sort of understand that it means that we believe this thing is true because it is in agreement with Scripture and all that kind of thing, and that we know that we've heard our pastors maybe at their ordination or their installation get up and swear to that, and so promise that they will teach in accordance with that. I don't know if I'd call it loose, but they just don't have the same sort of mental framework for subscribing to a confession in the same way. It's in there, right? I'm sure they have to study it. I'm sure they have to know it. But it seems to me that it's mostly informative. I could be wrong.
Well,
you're right. I was at a theological college in England, Wycliffe Hall, where they trained Anglican ordinands, and that was there used to be a statute, I think it goes back to like the 1570s, that they had to abide by the 39 articles and some sort of subscription, but that has long
Abide
since gone.
is sort of
but
looser.
that statute's been overturned, but it still is at least one of their documents they're going to look at.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Alongside the scriptures, alongside their reason, alongside ecclesiastical authority, and so on and so forth.
Even a Spong would have to have had it in his training somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess the idea of Lutheran subscription in its relation to this goes back all the way to the Augsburg Confession too, because like Henry VIII was presented the Augsburg Confession to sign on to.
I'd say it might be helpful. I don't want to
to.
put him on the spot, but for Adam to sort of go through the history of this, because
Yes.
if people think back a little, well, I think I can narrow that down a little bit for you.
Please do.
If you go back to our previous episodes when we did the history of the Reformation in Germany thing, and we spent a lot of time talking about, as all these confessions are presented, that there's a large political component to them that has to do with the reformers trying to put together this thing called the Small Chaldicke League that could sort of provide for the common defense of the Reformation states or the protesting states if and when the Pope and the Emperor decided to come north. And that many of these gatherings, including the Diet of Augsburg, were initially set up because they were worried too about the Turkish invasions that were going on. One of the things that I know to be the fact is that Henry was approached to be part of that Small Chaldicke League, and so you could easily say that some of the initial Lutheran influence on the English Reformation, especially to Henry, was an attempt to get him to agree to things like the Augsburg Confession, so that he would be part of this common defense of these protesting states. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, under Henry VIII, you actually really don't get Protestantism in England until after Henry VIII.
Right, until Edward.
There's a Reformation going on under Henry VIII, but it's mostly a political Reformation. One of the signature events is 1533, 1534, with the Acts of Supremacy, when it's declared that the king is now the head of the church in England. So it's very political or ecclesiastical / political. You've got certainly some people who have been influenced by Luther's ideas or by Lutheran theology working, Thomas Cranmer and others, but there's nothing officially Protestant yet until we get to Edward, who, I mean, and really he's not responsible for it.
No, he's got advisors.
Yeah, you've said in the past, though, Henry VIII despised Luther.
Yeah, he did not like Luther.
And is that true? Did that play a role in his rejection of the Augsburg Confession, or was it purely politics? And
so, as far from what I can remember, his dislike of Luther goes all the way back to the late teens and the early 20s, when Luther himself is still sort of being branded a heretic, and when Henry is still part of the church.
Did he not? He even, when Luther was given the bull, did a public book burning of Luther's books in England.
Yeah.
Pope praised him in 1521 and gave him the title Defender of the
Faith. And so he also, probably because they have similar personalities, can't stand Luther's personality. Just he's too bombastic. He's too wild with his words. And Henry was educated. I mean, he was not. He could track the arguments, as from what I've read, and he could make a decision on these things. Now, it seems like his passion sort of overtook his reason at some point in his life. But
Luther didn't undergird his multiple marriages either.
He didn't, but he and Melanchthon did write a letter denouncing his first divorce. And I'd have to look at the timing, but I recall back when I was this was years ago that I was looking into this, but so I'm a little bit from the hip here, but that when Luther and Melanchthon didn't sort of outrightly chastise Philip of Hesse for his bigamy,
and they didn't.
Henry sort of the modern phrase would be, was a little butthurt that they did openly chastise him for his divorce, and that he saw it as hypocritical, and that and so that sort of just adds to it. Now on the flip side of that, he did like Melanchthon. He liked Melanchthon quite a bit.
Many did.
Yeah. So, and he was open to Melanchthon's influence on. Again, I'm with Adam. At the point of Henry, you can't really call it a Reformation. I think what you could say was he was open to Melanchthon having influence on the theological direction of the Church of England. Yeah. So, which at this point, early with Henry, it's still very Roman Catholic-esque.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my impression was that as we talked about a lot with political influence, that his considering entrance into the Small Chaldaic League was almost entirely political, was needing an ally after sort of being separated from the Emperor of Rome, and really needing like military backup more than anything.
But I don't remember exactly what year, but I'm almost sure it was in the early 1530s. Henry even started to call himself an emperor.
Yeah.
Did he?
So you got that competition. So you got competition with the papacy, and then competition with the Habsburg house, emperor.
And then you have all the weird political interminglings with the fact that he's marrying essentially marrying into the family and all that kind of thing too.
Yeah.
8 times.
No, it's the second one. Right? First one.
Yeah.
First one. Sorry.
Well, Catherine of Aragon. Yeah, that was all to get in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so having this, how big is the Small Chaldaic League to give people, I guess, an impression?
I mean, you could judge it initially on the signers to the Augsburg Confession. I mean, those political leaders who signed the Augsburg Confession were sort of avowing themselves to Small Chaldaic League. Later, if you wanted to go later, you could certainly judge it by those who subscribed to the power and primacy of the Pope, who were at that meeting in those lands. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, I couldn't give a number, but it's basically northern Germany.
Yeah, it's northern Germany.
Okay, well, interesting. I mean, I don't know. It's I think it's a refreshing because so much of our modern idea of politics for people is completely separated from the idea of religion, and like the fact that Henry, part of the motivation for not joining the Small Chaldaic League was theological in nature, was not wanting to sign on to the Augsburg Confession, even though that might have been a politically questionable move for him and things like that. To see a political leader do something like that today would be pretty weird. To see, like, say, not have an ally with another nation because they were Buddhist or something like that.
Right. So it's interesting. Some of the initial contacts between Henry and the Lutherans that are substantial, or even where Robert Barnes comes into this, are in the mid 1530s, where this is where Melanchthon is being contacted by English ambassadors, and this is where Robert Barnes is sort of being relied on in England because he graduated from the University of Wittenberg. This is where the contacts are going out to Melanchthon. It's interesting to me that this is when this all starts, where Henry seems to sort of be open to some Lutheran influence coming in, as long as that Lutheran influence is via Melanchthon. And in 1535, of course, I've said this before, is the addition of Melanchthon's systematic theology, the Loci Communis, that he dedicates to Henry VIII.
Oh, and I didn't realize that.
Henry receives that dedication very positively, so much so that he pays Melanchthon 500 gulden for the dedication, which is equivalent to a year's salary for Melanchthon. So Melanchthon's already receiving a double salary at the University of Wittenberg.
In 35, he gets a triple.
For 35, he gets a triple.
In modern language, that means he's a baller.
Yeah,
right.
Right. And
wow.
So I think it's reasonable to believe, and there have been a couple PhD dissertations that have traced this out a little bit better, that 1535 Loci Communis probably had more influence on the English Reformation than we sort of commonly know, because it, as Henry dies and as Edward comes in and there's a different influence going on, that fades away a little bit. But we do know for a fact that it is the 1535 edition of the Loci Communes that's used to catechize Elizabeth. And we know, too, that when we finally get sort of a Church of England that accomplishes this quote-unquote middle way type thing, that it's under Elizabeth. It's later under Elizabeth. And that, like you said, many people who then read the 39 Articles and sort of are also familiar with the Augsburg Confession, they see a lot of
when I was reading it, I was going like, well, this is plagiarism, copy and paste, man.
Yeah, there is a lot of it that is, for sure. And we know that Cranmer was very influenced by Melanchthon, especially Cranmer was very influenced by Melanchthon. We also know, I think, pretty definitively, or I could tell you that the edition of the Loci that would likely be attractive to where the theologian and the Church of England are at this point in time would be the 1535. It's closer to. I don't want to get Melanchthon in too much trouble by saying this, but it's easier than the bondage of the will on issues of the will. Mm-hmm. It'll give a little bit more room on communion, on the Lord's Supper, than the Augsburg Confession. Mm-hmm. It allows for a very strong doctrine of good works. Mm-hmm. So, it's not the best. It's just it's just not great. So,
do you think? I mean, this is speculation, which is always, I know sometimes we get uncomfortable with on this show, but do you think part of the reception, not only the dedication, but the fact that the Loci is not a confessional document, there is no sort of political unification tied to Melanchthon sending you an edition of the Loci. There's no need to subscribe to it. It's sort of classically Melanchthon, sort of university pedagogy, like teaching the faith.
I don't know. And again, I'd look. I mean, I don't know how to answer that. I think maybe Adam can correct me on this, but it's unique. It's used to train pastors. I mean, it's right out of the gate. It's the result of university lectures, where the lectures are occurring almost primarily to train theologians and pastors, right? So there had been, like Aquinas's Summa, and there had been, of course, Lombard's sentences and whatnot that were put together. But it's the first theological work I'm aware of that comes out of the university movement from lectures that are teaching pastors. And then immediately once it's done, it becomes a textbook, specifically for the purpose of training theologians and pastors, primarily.
Luther would be in accord with that.
Yeah. And so it's not confessional, but it's also not just like, say, the Babylonian captivity of the church around the freedom of the Christian. It is for the church.
Yep.
In a way that just, whatever other book that you might write that is helpful to the church isn't. More comparable, sure. I think, to the catechisms.
Sure.
It's like
and there's a long history of that.
Yeah.
Priests had to read and work through Lombard sentences if they wanted to be priests. It was the given medieval order of the day. And so no wonder when Melanchthon writes his first edition of the Loci, Luther praises it as from heaven itself.
Really filled a need.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just that it's good, but it also sort of in that occasional theology really fit the occasion of training people.
That's a good way to think of it.
Yeah. Interesting. And then, I mean, do you also we've used the phrase that Lutheranism is born in the university on the show quite a few times, and I really like this. And what's funny to me is, and maybe this is just because of who I hang out around, you guys, but when I think of the word university, my mind is taken straight to England. I mean,
okay.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Like that's what I think of. Mm-hmm. Is there some element of that university sort of mentality that's sort of
the movement
a cross between Wittenberg and England? Then
the movements in England are taking place at Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, that's where they're
Yes.
Yeah, but as they say there, it's at Oxford, it's for burning. Cambridge is for learning.
For learning, yeah. Well, I was going to
evangelicals.
I was going to say the
burned at the stake.
The
there,
martyrs
yeah.
are burned at Oxford.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where they're burned.
Yeah.
The last thing I was going to say, even on this, is that Melanchthon too, and this makes sense for Henry and the fact that as the Church of England is being formed, they still incorporate bishops and the like. Is that Melanchthon gives more room for the continuation of the authority of bishops than many of the other Lutheran theologians. He even in the Power and Primacy of the Pope, you can see this. I mean, he starts that thing out by saying, I've got no problem with the authority of bishops as long as we recognize it as earthly authority and as long as they do their job.
Yeah, sort of just an ecclesiastical order issue. And there are Lutheran churches that have bishops today. The ELCA has bishops, right? For instance, that's the big one that
most of the European churches
do too. Yeah. In fact, we got to meet a couple.
Most of the African Lutheran churches do. I'd say outside of America is very common.
And we have. I mean, this might be controversial to say, but functionally, a role similar to bishops.
I think
in our synod.
I don't know. I think we have a system of polity that's very much American.
That's very much. Yeah, that's true.
I don't know. I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I'm just saying.
Are we talking ecclesiology here?
Yeah.
I'm watching
Rod's
Rosenblatt.
Rod's twitching.
It's like,
There's an old essay in the Journal of Ecclesiastical History by Alec Ryrie.
Now who's talking ecclesiology?
Well, it's the title is the Strange Death of Lutheran England. And Alec Ryrie, I think he's now at Durham. He was at Bristol for a while, but he's sort of one of the leading Reformation scholars there in England. And he argues that the Lutheran influence was quite significant in the late 1520s, 1530s.
Yeah.
But then,
It
he said
fades.
early 1540s, it just sort of disappears.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hence his title, The Strange Death of Lutheran England. But
Yeah.
and he says around 1543 or so, you start to see Henry, who's still Catholic, kind of, but also takes a very reform posture, especially with the iconoclasm, the clamping down of images and tearing apart monasteries and nunneries and so on.
Allowing them to be sold, too.
It's like the Lutheran influence. It influenced things from below.
Yeah.
A lot of those guys, though, are executed. You think
Right.
of Patrick Hamilton in Scotland. I think you mentioned Robert Barnes.
Yep.
William Tyndale in the early 1520s. Not really a Lutheran, but there's a lot of Lutheran influence on him. But then it just quietly
goes away.
Yeah.
Going back to your comment earlier in the
Flash
show,
in the pan.
how they managed to lose an empire.
Yeah. I mean, Lutherans are historically notorious for having only internal concerns too. So and if England's not Lutheran after 10 years of trying, they're gonna be like, well
that's
we gave it a shot, guys.
sort of. I sort of inquired about this to John Milbank, and he basically said, well, once the second generation of Lutheran reformers came around, like there was no more conversation between England and Germany.
I think that's true. I mean, good luck going into a used bookstore in Oxford or Cambridge and finding even one Lutheran book.
Yep.
I mean, I've tried. You're gonna be looking for a while.
How about Blackwell's at the bookstore?
Well, because they have
everything,
every modern printed books.
Okay.
If there's one that's selling, which is that's a long shot, it would probably be there, or one from a recognized academic author. Like one of our guys gets published by OUP or something like that, it would certainly be there.
Got to get some 1517 books in Blackwell. If you have a connection, please contact us. 1517.org.
You'd have a better shot just like visiting and sticking one on a shelf and running away.
You never know who listens to the show. We might have some friends somewhere.
There was a little tag on the back that says, "This one's free."
This one's free. That's funny.
I do. I think it's interesting to note, because we're talking about the flash in the pan, that might have been different if Melanchthon had actually been allowed to accept the invitation to go to England.
Yeah, can we? Yeah, let's talk about that.
It's. I want to say it's right after the 1535 Loci that he's invited by Henry to England. He's actually offered the chair of theology at Cambridge, which, I mean,
Man,
come on, you know.
that would have been cool.
Would you take that?
Yeah, I don't know. Cambridge is pretty cool. I like the mountains, but Cambridge is pretty cool. But he says no. Now, there's some debate on why he says no. When I first researched this, it was clearly because his elector told him, no way. Like, I'm not sure what's happening over there. I don't trust that guy. You're the most, literally, I think the phrase was, you're the most valuable asset we have here. I'm not letting you go. Jim Nestigan lately thinks he's found that it's because of Melanchthon's astrology. That he read the stars and believed that the stars told him he would die if he ever tried to cross an ocean.
Oh, gosh.
And so that he turned it down because he thought if he tried to cross the channel that he'd die.
Oh.
Whoa.
That's believable.
Does Dr. Horton ever remind me of that with regard to Melanchthon?
Yeah. Is he saying that Calvin wasn't into that stuff at all?
I think so.
Oh, wow. I mean, Luther really wasn't on the whole, but many of them were.
But Luther could do some
most
weird
of the-
things. I mean, you get these oddly born animals.
Yeah.
And he'll see that, or there's a whale that washed up
Yeah.
in Haarlem up in the Netherlands, not called that back then, but and he interpreted that as a sign of the end. And
he was very public in certain situations that he came from the peasantry. And he would say things like, if you want this said in the language of courts and kings, ask Philip.
Yeah, who there's some evidence to make me believe that he actually spent some time in court with his father, who was an armorer to many royalty. And so that makes some sense. And Melanchthon grew up with a private tutor, hired by his wealthy family and grandfather to come into the home and to teach him classical languages and classical literature from the time he was like 6 years old.
Well,
That's different than Luther's.
It is, yeah, very.
Yeah.
Very.
Now, Luther's family, to be fair, Luther's family came into money eventually, which is odd for the time and actually has a bit of a class change when his...
Yes, his father's mining business provided that.
Well, father, I believe, goes from being a miner to being the owner of the copper mine.
Yes.
So then there's some fun that having to do with why Luther might invoke St. Anne, or at least tell his father that he invokes St. Anne, patron saint of miners.
Yep. So I guess with the last couple of minutes, this is kind of funny to me, but the Church of England, Anglicans always called, or typically called the middle way.
The Via Media.
Yes.
Between Geneva and Rome.
Right.
Yeah. And I this one's always funny to me because when people start talking about it, because it's come back up, is it really between Geneva and Lutheranism? Is it really between...
No. There's a simple answer to that.
Yeah, go for it.
No. The answer is no.
No.
I'm like,
No,
yeah.
but I think, and I'll throw this question out there. It's the middle way between Geneva and Rome, but because it's the middle way between Geneva and Rome, it ends up looking somewhat Lutheran at times.
Yes. Well, and I kind of think sometimes I will funny when I'm around some Anglicans. I'll try to be funny, and maybe it's not funny, but I'll go, well, Lutheranism's the original middle way, really. Between Rome and the Anabaptists, and then the Reformed. Like, I mean, we've been the middle way the whole time.
Well, I heard that language when I was at the Springfield Seminary, that we're shooting one way at Rome and the other way at Geneva.
And the enthusiasts.
We've always been fighting wars on both sides.
Yes.
But we fight the enthusiasts for the same reason we fight Rome, to be clear.
Yes.
Where do you get your information?
From yourself, from God whispering to you, that kind of thing.
In the day when Luther and some of the others implied that Rome was just pure enthusiasm, all hell broke loose. To be compared to those people?
I think,
well,
we can get ourselves in trouble, but I think it is. It's I've sometimes even said that it's the difference between everybody having direct access to God and or one person having direct access, and then everybody listens to the one guy. It's like pick your poison.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think isn't it the small color articles that Luther refers to the Turks as enthusiasts as well.
I don't know.
Rome and the Muslims are enthusiasts.
Rome, the Muslims.
It's basically Luther against enthusiasts, everywhere.
Oh, that's
Which,
for sure.
I mean, is sort of like the basic argument against all of them, I guess, is that there's an epistemological error that's the same everywhere. That it's not.
That's my point.
Yeah, it's not scripture.
How do you know? Well, you got to ask this guy because he's talking to God, or you got to ask yourself, or ask God to talk to you so that you can know directly.
Yeah.
Or you search the scriptures.
Yeah, I wish we taught this better to our own. Even if it were just, it's like Dorothy Sayers says, if you teach church history well, the cults will not get traction in your country. But she meant to the laity. She meant teaching church history a la all the heresies. And then you'd recognize that, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses were Arians. Or you'd notice, and we have the ability to do that for the laity. But I don't know any great lay-level books where we bother.
No. Or that most of the modern errors and generic evangelicalism and how enthusiast it is Gnostic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we could give ourselves
not
a little
that difficult a connection to draw.
No.
But, 1517 should get a little credit for the fact that we do publish books that are sort of lay-level, catechetical in nature regarding all these types. Every year we publish different edited volumes that address particular
all for
problems and podcasts and things like that. I think that's actually one of the things that we've done pretty well is to identify sort of those gaps and return. This is no longer about Lutheranism on the Church of England, but Lutheranism, born at the university and also grounded in catechizing and sharing that education with lay, and then encouraging families then to continue that education. When we start slipping, you can see it. It's visible in our churches when we start losing that. When catechesis becomes sort of this arbitrary 2 years for middle schoolers and not sort of an actual lifelong education. When
you've got
pastoral training isn't, not liberal in the sense of liberalism, but liberal in the sense of
ceases. I'm not going to get myself in too much trouble. When it ceases to be called pastoral education and begins to be called something else.
Yeah.
You've got to have when that's part of what you are, you've got to have a publishing house that supports it. I'll leave it at that.
Well,
so without getting ourselves in too much trouble,
we should stop.
We should probably stop talking and wrap up this episode. And to close it out, thank you for asking this question today that led us to this episode. Thank you for supporting 1517. I don't want to sound like we are too braggadocious or something like that, but to the donors who have made the Thank You Fellows possible, the publishing house possible, and all the other projects we do to sort of help fill this gap and be able to do this history and make people aware of where they came from, where things are going, and that we can continue to provide resources to sort of educate people and to proclaim the gospel to them daily. Thank you. If you're considering supporting us, we'd really appreciate it if you did. And we go to 1517.org/give, and there's also a donate button on the top right-hand corner of the website. It's very easy to get to. Any amount helps. I've said this before, and it may sound weird to some people, but monthly recurring donations, even if they're really small, help because of the consistency.
Yeah, they really help us.
They really... It's good to have regular support because we know you're sort of there continuing listening, that we didn't lose you somewhere along the way, and then we can keep in regular contact with you and things like that. So please, again, thank you if you are a donor, and thank you for considering donating to what we do. Thank you for listening to this episode of Thank You Fellows. We'll catch you next week. Bye.